I can put it on the bottom.
That's probably better. If it's not, we'll just tell people it's there.
Okay. And then obviously, also back and forth is just the key.
Just back and forth?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just like destroying rooms is okay. But I'm just going to declare the session opened. Welcome, Amber, for talking to us about trinitarian metaphysics of pregnancy, is what I'm going to call it.
Maybe.
I've got very excited about that.
Sort of.
Thanks for joining us, despite not feeling 100%.
So thank you so much, Elsaline. Thank you for organizing. Everyone who helped with the organization who's here, like, thank you for showing up. I think this is a fascinating topic, and I think it's really interesting. Can everyone hear me okay right now? Okay. Can the people online hear me? I'm going to work on the assumption that they can, and will say something if they can't. Okay, since I missed introductions this morning, I'm sorry for missing. I've been sick for like the last 6 weeks or something, on and off of various things, and I thought I was over this last cold, and it just came roaring back when I flew over here, and so I'm having I had a bit of a warning, but I'm here now. I'm good. But since I missed introductions, my name is Amber Griffioen. I'm from the United States. I've lived in Konstanz, Germany for the past 15 years or so. I worked at the University of Konstanz for a while. But for the past 3 years, I've been working for Duke Kunshan University, which is it's a new university that was founded just before the pandemic. It's a cooperation between Duke University in the United States and Wuhan University in China. I teach remotely currently, but starting next year, I'll be moving to part-time. So one of my big things is I'm transitioning right now out of full-time academia. And working on certification to become what I call an existential coach for reproductive struggle and life transitions. I plan to keep my foot in academia, but I really want to do a lot more public-facing work, and not just the kind that's like refable, but the kind that where I feel like I can actually make a difference. I feel like I make a difference in the classroom and stuff, but it's a different kind of thing, and I really have just kind of had it with academia. So I'm sort of transitioning out. And so I think you're going to see some of the considerations I'm bringing to the table today really are grounded in these kinds of, pragmatic political concerns, thinking about the kinds of clients that I deal with, thinking about the kinds of issues that I've gone through, and thinking about these kinds of questions from a very sort of personal and social standpoint. Of course, that might lead one to ask, well, then why the hell do Trinitarian metaphysics? We'll see. But I think, like the previous paper, for me, this is sort of like an experiment in imagination. And we'll just kind of see where it takes us, if anywhere. I'm going to stand and just kind of move around a little bit. It'll help me get my thoughts a little bit clear. It is going to be a very blurry kind of talk, but most generally speaking, I'm just going to kind of introduce you to the idea. I'm going to actually start out with objections and replies, because I think there may be some resistance to the idea of bringing philosophy of religion into the discourse on pregnancy. So I want to kind of tell you why I think it might be worth it. Then I'm going to talk more about imagination. So a lot of my work in philosophy of religion, including the book that's coming out hopefully in the spring of next year, is around the religious imagination, but also around the ways in which our philosophical and theological discourse, the kinds of imaginings that we sort of proceed from, and how flipping some of those on their heads or thinking about things differently, even if we might not have necessarily good ontological reason to do so, might help bring things that we care about into sharper relief in ways that can be very useful in philosophy. I'm going to lay out a little bit of the sort of territory when it comes to Trinitarian metaphysics for those who aren't familiar. It's going to be very bare bones. I'm not going to get into all of it unless we get into a little bit of it at the end. But then I want to kind of draw the comparison to the metaphysics of pregnancy discourse and see whether this comparison might be useful or not. Okay, I will be talking about infertility and pregnancy laws probably at some point during this, because a lot of the work that I'm doing in philosophy and philosophical theology is on the philosophy of miscarriage and pregnancy laws. And I think when you start viewing things from that point, like our definitions of pregnancy start to look much different. When you look at support groups and the ways that people are thinking about their pregnancy losses, the way that we talk about pregnancy becomes much different. Same with parenthood and other related kinds of concepts. So I am going to bring some of those considerations in today. So I just wanted to kind of warn you that that's going to be a subject that I'm going to touch on. Okay, so the germs of the proposal today are sort of, I feel like if I'm in the UK, I have to say something like mayhap. I know it's very archaic, but you know, mayhap, just like maybe, perhaps, possibly, we might be able to gain some insight into or to sort of fruitfully reimagine pregnancy by looking at trinitarian metaphysics in Christian philosophical theology. A discourse that is largely dominated by white males, though not exclusively, but in feminist theology, also grappling with Trinitarian metaphysics has been kind of a big issue. So they want to push back on traditional Trinitarian metaphysics in a lot of cases. Okay, so like what? Why should we be bringing philosophy of religion into our discourse on pregnancy? So you might have various kinds of worries. So one, we might just say, look, our philosophy is kind of allergic. I know a lot of people who are very allergic to philosophy of religion, at least of a certain kind. I get that worry, I share that worry, even though I am somebody who does philosophy of religion. And I also think that philosophy of religion, like the Theo bros, this is what we call them in the discipline, but like, if you want to find out more about the Theo bros and the role that they play in American Christian evangelicalism, Kristen Dumais has a nice Substack piece on that recently. She wrote Jesus and John Wayne, also a great book. But the Theo bros have done real damage, I think, in the bioethical discourse on abortion. And I know there are some complaints out there also that like, they have no idea how the biology works. They're just kind of coming in blind. And I do think that they have done and are doing real damage in the discourse on reproductive rights. You might be worried about that. And that leads into the moral / socio-political worry, like the religious right has really co-opted the discourse around pregnancy and abortion in the political sphere, and especially the Christian right. So is bringing sort of Christian metaphysics into the philosophy of pregnancy really a useful and beneficial kind of thing? And then what I call the George Carlin worry. This is from like old school George Carlin stand-up where he's talking about going to a Catholic priest, right? And every week they go in, they say, "Duh, father," and then ask some like warped metaphysical question, you know, like, oh, could God lift a rock so heavy that he himself cannot lift it? Oh, duh, father, what do you think about that? And then the priest would always respond, well, my son, it's a mystery, right? And the Trinity in Christian thought is one of the so-called mysteries of the faith. So aren't we really sort of like bringing more mystery into discussions of pregnancy, not sort of backwards, right? Shouldn't we be demystifying pregnancy as opposed to sort of remystifying pregnancy? Because the answer, well, my son, it's a mystery, is not particularly satisfying, right? So with regard to the first story, I mean, I do want to ask, like, whose philosophy is our philosophy? So if you're someone who says, like, my philosophy is allergic to philosophy of religion, well, okay, but like, whose philosophy is that? Why should we as a group kind of be allergic in that way? Second, we have an allergy-friendly version that a way to think about what we're doing today that can kind of, you know, or you can like, I thought about sending around my email address and being like, you have to send me an email if you have an allergy to philosophy of religion, so that you cannot be held, so that cannot be held liable for any like damage that might occur if philosophy of religion sneaks in. That's a joke for those who were at dinner last night. But the allergy-friendly version is basically, you can think about what I'm doing today, sort of like I think a lot of medieval thinkers, I do medieval philosophy on the side, a lot of medieval thinkers thought about angelology, which is basically as a kind of thought experiment. So like Dominique Perner, and there's another German guy, German professor, just published a book on angelology, but they tend to think of medieval discussions around angels and stuff as medieval thought experiments, kind of saying, okay, well, what can we say about the intellect if the intellect is in a body, but it's completely different from the human intellect, and like these levels of reality between the divine and the human being. So think of this just sort of thought experimentally, not as sort of like, I'm trying to, shove God down your throat or in your uterus or anything like that. And finally, let's take back the discourse, right? If the Christian right is co-opting the abortion debate, let's take it back. And let's show why this kind of stuff can be useful for doing, say, feminist sociopolitical philosophy. And as somebody who is moving into this kind of coaching space and into the philosophical counseling sphere, we need political and pastoral resources to address things like pregnancy loss that can combat this kind of theobro rhetoric around pregnancy. So I think developing new ways of connecting religion and pregnancy is super important. Karen O'Donnell has a lovely book on the theology of reproductive loss called The Dark Womb. Highly recommend if you're interested in looking at this stuff further. But I do think, we need to kind of take back the discourse. And finally, with respect to the whole, like, it's a mystery kind of thing, again, this is just a way of sort of imagining differently. And I think sometimes like weirding the discourse a bit, queering pregnancy, and as I'm working on in my book, like queering God, I think is a really important project. Even if at the end of the day, we don't think these things are true, they might sort of shake us out of our dogmatic slumber in a way that can help us think about the assumptions that we're bringing to the table when we do talk about pregnancy. So, okay, bear with me. That's the lesson. Now, what got me thinking about this was a passage by Serene Jones where she's talking about pregnancy loss. And she's talking about how, Christians have sort of thought of the Trinity as a mystery in various ways over the centuries. And she says, Christian theologians have sort of broke their brains over the question of like how a wholly perfect God could contain death within God's self, because in Christianity, Christ, who is fully human and fully divine, dies on the cross. And the idea is that the Godhead somehow contains death within itself. And this has been, a mystery in Christian theology. And Serene Jones says, they've told us we must simply ponder the cross and its mysteries, but perhaps its imaginative resources, the resources of the tradition, have been limited by the morphological imaginations of its mostly male theologians. Perhaps what we find in space of silence is the image of the woman who, in the grips of a stillbirth, has death inside her and does not die. So human biology and the way that, we have this in our everyday lives, and the fact that imagining how something living could have death inside of it in this kind of way is no stranger to the woman who has suffered pregnancy loss. And so she says, maybe we need to imagine differently. And so I'm kind of flipping this on its head, and instead of saying we need to think about God differently given pregnancy, the idea is maybe like we can think about pregnancy a little bit differently given some of the discourse about God. So the proposal is, and I think that some people in this room, probably many people in this room, are exceptions to this rule, but I think our political and philosophical imaginations have been limited for a long time by a certain conception of pregnancy, which is that we take as our starting point the distinction between the gravida and the foster, between the parent and the fetus, the pregnant person and the fetus. We sort of assume there's a distinction from the beginning, and then we try to kind of work our way to like, how are they connected? But as anybody who has ever been pregnant knows, there is a very special, I don't want to say unique, especially because it's very common, but there is a certain special kind of unity between a pregnant person and a fetus in pregnancy that we have to account for, I think, in any sort of approach to pregnancy. And the question is, what if we begin from unity instead of from distinction? And so here, at the very least, I think like mystifying the discourse a little bit and considering some of the relevant analogies and disanalogies might help us tease out some of our implicit assumptions in the pregnancy discourse. And so I have this quote from Wittgenstein on the bottom. You don't have to care about it, but it's about, you know, certain ideas holding us captive. This is a picture of Mary with the pregnant Jesus. It's actually the only medieval image that I found of Mary pregnant with Jesus. So there's lots of images of pregnant Mary, but not with like a little baby Jesus inside. I was at there was a really good exhibition in Zurich on medieval bodies. It's very good. And this was one of the images of pregnancy that they had, but clearly thinking of these as, you know, distinct individuals, like you just have this little person inside this big holy person. So, okay, what if we shift the discourse? That's the premise of the rest of the talk. A little background for those of you who are, you know, not up on your Trinitarian metaphysics. This is a kind of famous symbolic representation of the Trinity. Also kind of looks like a uterus. I don't know, draw some fallopian tubes on it, I think. But the mystery of the Christian Trinity is supposed to be the following. Christianity takes as its fundamental premise that it is a monotheistic religion. So it takes as its fundamental assumption that there is only one God, and there is to invoke the Shahada, there is no God but God, right? And yet Christianity speaks of different persons, or the Greek hypostases of the Trinity, and finds biblical support for this. So the tradition has maintained that there are three persons of the Trinity. Take person lightly here. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in the historical tradition. The first person, historically called the Father, is often associated with power, with creative power, and also in Augustine and much of the tradition with like the human faculty of memory. So there's a Trinitarian way in which every human being images or mirrors the divine. So the faculty of memory corresponds to the paternal person of the Trinity. The second person is the Son. This is Jesus Christ. Also known in the Greek tradition as the Logos. So the beginning of John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The word there is Logos. In the Latin, it's ratio. Christ is seen as the mediator between sort of the creative power of the divine and the world, right? And in Christianity, Christ then becomes incarnate and comes down as, you know, Jesus. And which is the answer to every Sunday school question, right? They ask you a question in Sunday school and you don't know the answer, just go, Jesus? Jesus is the answer to everything. The way, the truth, the life, the logos, the ratio. But also for people like Meister Eckhart, I do a lot of work in medieval mysticism. Meister Eckhart says, for example, that the Godhead speaks creation, right? And it becomes, so in this act of speaking, God creates, and the word that is spoken, this creative word, is the second person of the Trinity. It's the Logos. Associated then with the intellect, or the faculty of the understanding of the human being. The third person of the Trinity, historically, the Holy Spirit, associated with love. So we have memory, understanding, and love or will, right? Three faculties of the human being in which we image the divine. And the Holy Spirit sort of binds the other two together, as it were. In the tradition, the Father is God, the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God, but the Father does not equal the Son, does not equal the Spirit. So there are properties of the Father that do not hold of the Son and the Spirit. The Father is unbegotten, for example, self-caused, however you want to put it. But the second person is, according to Orthodox Christianity, begotten, not made. So it's not, Jesus is not a creature. Nah. But the Son is at least logically and possibly metaphysically posterior to the first person of the Trinity, the Father. And the Spirit, predictably, spirates from the Father and later the Father and the Son. So you have this whole filioque debate in the Middle Age, and actually in ancient Christianity as well, about whether the Spirit spirates from just the Father or the Father and the Son. And then they decide it is the Father and the Son. That's why it's called the filioque, which means and the Son. And so the Spirit has this property that the Son and the Father do not have. So the Father is not the Son, is not the Holy Spirit, and yet all of these things are God, and it doesn't look like those claims can be affirmed without contradiction. And so the big thing in Christian metaphysics, especially in analytic philosophy of religion, is to figure out whether there are ways in which we can make sense of this. And at the end of the day, they'll still kind of default to the George Carlin, like, well, my son, it's a mystery. Or they're going to say, we need revelation to get some of these premises, but then we can get these conclusions. But folks throughout the centuries have really tried to think about how can we make sense of this unity and distinction in one being. Okay, so that's your Trinitarian stuff to start off with. I don't even know how I'm doing on time. Okay, the theological topography. Basically, you've got two heresies on each side, and then you have what's supposed to be the happy medium. It's a heresy to say there are three gods, because Christianity is supposed to be monotheistic. So if you say, well, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, yeah, they're each God, and they're just like a group of people at a bus stop, right, who do stuff together, then, you know, heresy, anathema. That's called tritheism. On the other side, you have an overemphasis on the unity of the divine, where you just say, look, the different persons are just different aspects or different parts that make up a unity or a whole. But we're really just talking about like aspects or levels or parts. Who is it? Brian Leftow has a view on which it's sort of an adverbial view, but God is made up of sort of like temporal parts. And depending on which part of God, like how God is being expressed at a given time, you can have this sort of unity that's made up of various kind of temporal parts that can exist simultaneously. If any of you have seen, has anyone here seen The Haunting of Hill House, Mike Flanagan's reinterpretation of Hill House? Oh, it's so good. If you love horror, like I watch it every Halloween, the series, but okay, well then I'm not going to explain that, but there's a really good horror analogy here with the bent neck lady that I think works well. Anyway, so you got modalism as a heresy on the one side, you've got tritheism as a heresy on the other, and everybody tries to fit their views in between that so as not to be accused of Arianism or Sabellianism or some other, you know, cool sounding heresy. Modalism is a heresy because it's overemphasizing the unity at the expense of the three-personhood of God. It's going to get you into trouble, especially with things like the incarnation and Christ being both divine and human. And they want to say, you know, God is more than just a Janus face, right? So they want something, yeah. But here's the thing. Christianity proceeds from the assumption that unity is super important and tries to figure out the distinction stuff in order to make the unity work. But they're really proceeding from the assumption of unity. That's what's really important. And then trying to avoid these heresies on either side. And I think that in the philosophy of pregnancy, and just in the way we think about pregnancy in general, we kind of start from distinction and then try to figure out, well, how do we have this special kind of union? What happens if we sort of switch it around and we start? So I'm not saying these views are heretical. I'm just saying these are two different poles on which views fall. But, what if we start with unity and kind of move towards distinction? Where do the views of pregnancy that we might have fall along this line? Because again, we have this kind of state that admits both of unity and distinction, and the question is, how does that fit together? I think on the distinction side, clearly we have container views, right? It's sort of like one pole of this continuum. But I think, if we think about pregnancy as a corporation or a kind of community, so I prefer the community view to the corporation view. I'm thinking here more of something like a bell hooks kind of community of care. Maybe strong relational views on which someone's relation to the fetus determines whether or not it's sort of has personhood or what its moral status might be. They might kind of fall towards the distinction side because you really have to have these two distinct things that can relate in these ways. This is where I think that Elseline's work has actually been a great boon to the philosophy of pregnancy, is that it does emphasize more strongly the kind of unity of the gravida and the foster, even if understanding them in terms of parts, because parts are part of a whole, right? So we're not just thinking of these two separate things, but rather as something more like a unity. And I think it's something that sort of resembles modalism on the Christian side. Again, not a heresy, though some people would think so, right? But a pole. Okay? And maybe if we're getting into like, organismic parthood, can, organisms be, can you have an organism of the same kind be a part of another organism? Maybe we could think about things about temporal parthood and stuff, but I think we can conceive of pregnancy more on this pole than on the other pole, or at least we want to think about the fact that these are two different poles and think about the sort of spectrum between them. Okay, I'm not actually going to draw an analogy here. Again, this is just supposed to be a springboard for reflection, not actually saying like, let's do the metaphysics of the Trinity. But one way we might start thinking about, and I suppose some of you already have thought about this, is constitutional models, thinking about material constitution. So you have these things, this goes on in medieval philosophy too, in Aristotelian philosophy, where you try to figure out, you have a lump of bronze, it's a statue of Athena. If you melt down the bronze remains, but the statue of Athena disappears. Mike Ray and Jeff Brower have a paper in which they say there are different kinds, there are different senses of the identity copula is, or of is in general, is a predication, is of numerical sameness. Under numerical sameness, you have the is of identity. And then they say there's a kind of is that implies numerical sameness without identity. And they try to make sense of that concept. The Athena and bronze is on one side of this, which is what Aristotle would call accidental sameness, because it didn't have to be a statue of Athena, it just was kind of accidentally a statue of Athena could have been Socrates. And they say, we want to postulate another kind of sameness under numerical sameness without identity, namely essential sameness. So we say the Father is God, the Son is God, the Spirit is God. We have numerical sameness, but we don't have identity of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And they try to spell that out. Now, I'm not going to spell that out in terms of pregnancy, but I just think it's interesting to see the way in which the philosophy of religion space is opening up some of these new ways of thinking about the copula, thinking about identity, reaching back to medieval philosophy, which I know some of you guys are doing too, and then even back to ancient philosophy with like Aristotelian substance stuff. It would be interesting to see how some of this might play out if we were developing views of pregnancy and where they would fall on these kinds of, on a chart like this. For me, I've been toying with the idea, kind of drawing from Anna-Sophie Meinke, who was supposed to be here, I think, but couldn't be, on her process view of pregnancy, thinking about also process theology with Whitehead and others. But thinking about pregnancy as a process of moving from unity to distinction, and how we might understand that, what we might locate across along the way. Again, This is just me trying to kind of, you know, imagine a little bit differently, but thinking about various possible ends of pregnancy and how much they rely on unity and how much they rely on distinction. So things like on the unity side, which is temporally sort of, you know, around conception or implantation, we have things like chemical and ectopic pregnancies. Some of you may have heard of fetal resorption. So sometimes the fetus is reabsorbed back into the body of the pregnant person when a miscarriage happens. These are not supposed to be necessarily distinct temporally. Sometimes you need a D&C if you haven't, say, bled out, like you might put bleeding out here somewhere. Pregnancy might end with a D&C or an extraction. This is something that, at least for many women, feels like something distinct from them is being taken out of them. There's lots of different, I've taken some continuing education classes on accompanying women through miscarriages and what you can do with the biological material that either is excised via a D&C or that comes out when a woman bleeds out things, and how to like separate the very, very small and almost unrecognizable embryo or fetus from the rest of the material, and what you can do with that so that the woman can memorialize it. Again, here you have this kind of emphasis that moves a little bit more towards the distinction side of things. Maybe there's a viability thing here in terms of moral status, I don't know. And then around here, you would have live birth and or stillbirth as sort of a case in which we really think of things as becoming quite distinct from one another. And, you know, we can ask questions along the way, like how many things clench a fist, how many things raise a finger or whatever, at which point in the pregnancy, you know, can different things, you know, it does seem weird. I think we had this at one of the, yes, I will wrap up. I think we had one of these things at one of the previous conferences. It feels like if I lift my finger, the fetus doesn't lift its finger and so on. So how much overlap do we want? I also think that relational views could fall anywhere on the spectrum. They don't have to be such strong relational views. I think we might be able to develop relational views that move towards the unity side of things a little bit. I'd be interested in thinking about what that might look like. Certainly, many women struggling with infertility do want to call themselves mothers and parents and so on, even after only having lost embryos at very early stages. And while that may be a pragmatic issue or a social issue, it is worth thinking about in terms of moral status, as well as conceptual questions like who counts as a parent. Yeah, and basically that's it. So I'm just, it's nothing, all of this is super bare bones, no pun intended. But I just want us to think about what happens when we start from unity and go towards distinction as opposed to the other way around, and whether that changes anything or maybe not. So thank you very much. Thanks for letting me talk at you, and I look forward to your questions.
How don't you start? Okay, well, I'm going to the ones on your poll, I like the poll view, and I like explanations are very much of this, and I wish I could have more. What about I just wonder whether the quantity really is the most extreme of the poll. It's the most extreme of the poll. I mean, if you and I sort of, I don't think it quite sketchy, but you know, if you were to say, really, there is no fetus. I mean, not there's no material, there's no matter, but you know, there's just one organism, and really birth is when something becomes into existence. I just wonder if that isn't the pole and part of it for that. I think it's sort of related. I'm struck by what described the memorializing of miscarriage. So you know, I should say immediately, yeah, right. I mean, any woman should do whatever she feels is right for her and her grieving processes. But, you know, nonetheless, taking a look at that quietly away from that particular process about the implications. I mean, it takes a very particular metaphysical view on pregnancy. You know, I mean, alone the fact that you want to separate the fetus from the rest, as opposed to considering the whole, you know, there's so much in there. It's just, but it is how you're still construing pregnancy very much away from what it is.
Yeah, so on your first point about parthood maybe not being the most extreme pole, yes, for sure. I think there probably are, and I think we can imagine views in which unity is even more strongly conceived of as than parthood. That's why I kind of have like the parthood stuff more here. But of the views that are generally under discussion right now, at least that I'm aware of, parthood seems to be on the kind of one pole and the container view on the other. But yeah, I would be very interested in views in which unity is even more strongly kind of metaphysically put forward. But then you have these issues about things like pregnancy loss and how you conceptualize that. And so one of the things that I've done, so I have a couple articles. One is a philosophical theology of pregnancy loss, or like towards a philosophical theology of pregnancy loss. The other one is called Embryonic Afterlives. I like the title, but it really looks like I'm doing some sort of like anti-abortion paper, and that's not what this is at all. But a lot of women, there are like message boards and groups and stuff about angel babies, right? And people talk about, oh, I have all these babies in heaven. Someday I'm going to see all my babies when I get to heaven. And this is a comforting thought for a lot of women. For me, I find this frightening and anxiety provoking. I'm like, am I going to have to mother all these fetuses that I've lost in heaven? Are they going to be babies? Are they going to be grown-ups? Like I find this very, like, I get very anxious when I think about all the responsibility. But this is something that a lot of people really struggle with, who do believe in an afterlife, is like, what do we say about these? And even Augustine says something like, he says that, well, unfortunately, formed fetuses, they all go to hell because they're not baptized. But it's like the nice hell, like in Dante's Inferno. It's like the one where the philosophers are, where like, you know, maybe like you don't really realize that you're in hell, like it's okay. And then Aquinas comes along and is like, no, they realize what they're missing out on, but they're okay with it, or like God makes them feel good, like okay about it or something. I mean, this whole theological discourse is super interesting in the history of philosophy. But Augustine was very sensitive to these issues, and he says, well, what are we to say about the unformed fetuses? He calls them abortivi, and he says, what are we to say about these unformed fetuses? And he says, are they not perhaps just more like seeds on the wind that just blow away and nothing happens to them? So he's actually willing to admit that human life could be conceived. There could be a pregnancy, as it were, and yet when the embryo dies in a very early stage, nothing happens. It's just gone, right? And so in the paper that I wrote, I actually try to harken back to the notion of microchimerism and fetal reabsorption, together with contemplative philosophical notions of mystical union, and to think about the idea of an afterlife in which all the pregnancy losses that one has experienced, one is sort of mystically one with these, so that one is aware that one is unified in such a way, but there is no distinction. And that way you don't have to deal with the problem of like mothering fetuses in the afterlife, or like, will they all be 33 years old, or, you know, whatever. And so I'm trying to kind of move towards a unity view of pregnancy, and to say, yet we could still make room for pregnancy loss and afterlives and stuff like that. I don't know how that's going to play out. Sorry, that was a really long answer. I apologize.
That's great.
Thanks. That was really interesting and unexpectedly so.
Sorry, I hear very
can you hear
poorly.
me?
Can you
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So you had a similar slide to that one where you had unity on one side and distinction on the other. Yeah, that
Yeah.
one. And on the left-hand side, you have conception / implantation, as both being on the side of the unity thing. So I was thinking, obviously, if you think of pregnancy as starting with implantation, then yeah, it goes from unity to distinction. But it seems, but the implantation process is a process, and before that, there is actually more distinction than after that. So it looks like it goes from distinction to unity and then to distinction again.
Yeah, so this is not a good chart. This was my like in the haze of cold medicine throwing together on a PowerPoint slide chart. This was sort of supposed to be like a timeline. It doesn't have to be that pregnancy begins. So my own view of pregnancy, I've been working on this definition for a really long time, and I keep making like tweaks to it. But my own definition, I'm going to try to remember it. Because it really tries to take into account the idea that, so for example, I had in vitro fertilization, in which we had fertilized eggs and little embryos that I bled out within like a week. And they always call you, like, they say you're poopo, like pregnant unless proven otherwise or something on the message board, and like, but I think, I know lots of people who think that like when they've had an embryo transferred, they are pregnant. And so there's all these different definitions, right? Conception, implantation, conception doesn't work because it can happen outside of the human, outside of the body. I don't like implantation because ectopic pregnancies and chemical pregnancies, things that we call pregnancies that I think we shouldn't call pregnancies, such that their losses are pregnancy losses. So I think my own definition ends up being something like pregnancy begins when a fertilized egg comes to be in a place in the human body in which it could successfully implant. So it's like a potentiality kind of thing. And that allows, so you can't like subcutaneously inject an embryo and be pregnant, right? Or swallow an embryo or something pregnant. It has to be in a place where it can successfully implant, but it will allow for ectopic pregnancies and biochemical pregnancies and stuff like that. So I do think there's stuff prior to that that's much more on the unity side than anything else. I just thought that intuitively, the beginning of pregnancy is something where we think of things much more in a much more unified way. And as the pregnancy goes on, in general, we intuitively think of two distinct things becoming more and more distinct. We don't have to think that way. And some people don't. But I think that in general, that's sort of phenomenologically how we was.
Okay, thanks.
So driven by capturing the important sense of pregnancy loss, right? So another way of doing this is saying when we use reproductive loss.
Yep.
I mean, I can imagine that if you have an embryo in a freezer and you don't implant it, but nonetheless, you have lots of emotive aspects, and I think that the definition of pregnancy is somewhat appropriate. There can be some space in the definition of pregnancy and the recognition of reproductive loss of reproductive.
Yeah. Personally, it's just because I've put the sort of put the cart in front of the horse on purpose. Because in these discussions, we tend to think of, for example, pregnancy, like I think there's an old talk of yours where she said something like, yeah, and typically it ends at birth. And I'm like, actually, where you said something about a live birth. This is an old talk, but I remember seeing this and being like, well, actually, typically, that is not when pregnancy ends. Numbers place pregnancy loss at upward of 60%, some as high as 90% if you take into account very, very early miscarriages. Others is like a very conservative estimate is around 40%. But like a hell of a lot of pregnancies end in miscarriage. So what is typical, biologically typical for human beings, is not live birth necessarily. Human reproduction is very wasteful. And that's another project I'm working on, is pregnancy loss and theodicy. But because of that, I have been kind of intentionally putting that cart in front of the horse and saying, what does pregnancy look like if we take these experiences seriously, qua experiences of pregnancy loss? But yeah, it might turn out that there are more useful ways of imagining, where we can reimagine these things as reproductive loss, and that might be good for people. That might be therapeutically good for people. And if that's so, I would not object to it either. But I'm a pragmatist through and through, so.
Thank you very much. So this was a journey, right? But in the spirit of so we were promised a demystification.
No.
Right?
Not promise to.
Or there was a suggestion that, why bring in trinitarian metaphysics, which is typically mysterious, into pregnancy, unless it somehow demystifies it? Like why? And my Trinitarian metaphysics is not really my milieu, but like my understanding is that, one of the big problems is that, it doesn't conform to the kinds of logic that we want to preserve. So, there's a problem with the transitivity of identity. And without solving any of those problems, how is this demystifying pregnancy, right? We haven't solved any of the problems of Trinitarian metaphysics. It's mystical and mysterious. So just saying, let's be Trinitarian metaphysicians of pregnancy, I'm waiting for the sell.
Right, so let me, okay. You go capitalist, let me sell it to you. First of all, I would say you're shopping for the wrong things, or maybe in the wrong department. But what I think is, so what I'm trying to do, the minimal thing that I'm trying to do here is to say, look, in both Trinitarian, so all analogies have a disanalogy, right? There's a lot of disanalogies here. But, in Trinitarian metaphysics and in the metaphysics of pregnancy, we have a certain kind of special problem of unity and distinction that we're grappling with. And so the minimal thing that I would like you to buy from me is that it might be fruitful, instead of sort of automatically proceeding from distinction and trying to figure out the unity bit, to try on for size views that might emphasize the unity over the distinction. You don't have to do it the way that Trinitarian metaphysicians do it. That's just like the broad bit. The more specific stuff was that, so last year I was at this conference on the history of philosophy of pregnancy, and talking to Elsaline about some of this stuff. And I've listened to some papers at some bump conferences in the past, where I was participating online. And I just remember thinking to myself, I was like, man, I've heard this stuff before. Where have I heard it? And then been like, oh yeah, it's the white Theo bros doing Trinitarian metaphysics. I was like, okay, so the second suggestion is it might maybe be useful to go to some of that literature and see the ways in which they're grappling with violations of Leibniz's law and stuff like that, and say, is any of this stuff useful for us? It might not be, in which case you throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? So that's just kind of maybe there are fruitful ways for these discourses to come together by using similar strategies, but maybe not, right? Because, well, my son, it's a mystery, right? So I did not intend to promise any sort of demystification. The other thing to say is that I'm a big fan of sort of disruptive imaginings. So I like the idea of just turning things on their heads, or, you know, being in a sort of Meister Eckhartian spirit, being sort of intentionally disruptive with language or with ideas, to force us to think about what we're assuming when, and what we're proceeding from, and so on. Some of us may be totally clear about what we're proceeding from, some of us might not be, but I think sometimes in these discourses, there's not just enthymematic premises, but there are just sorts of ways of imagining things that sort of govern the discourse. And I want to just try to say, like, yeah, but you know, what if we thought about it this way? So it's a very minimal cell. Please do not do straightforward Trinitarian metaphysics on pregnancy, unless you think that some of the discussions of constitution and various ways of thinking about accidental and essential sameness and something might actually be useful. And I think maybe they could, but I don't know. Yeah, so I hope that helps.
I love this book, it's so interesting, thank you. So this is kind of a rambling combination of comments rather than
A question, so sorry in advance.
That's cool.
The
Just at the
first-
end, just say, what do you think about that? And then I'll do that.
Okay, cool. So one thing I wanted to ask is whether you've come across Peter Damien Fellner's book, Marian Metaphysics, because I think that might be
Who's what?
Peter Damien Fellner.
No, I haven't. I'll have to
So
look at it.
one of the things in there that I kind of thought might potentially be interesting / useful / I don't know, stupid. You might have something to make out of it, is that he at one point suggests that we can conceive of the Holy Spirit as the relationship between Mary and Jesus, like as a kind of an identity.
That's a fairly common,
Yeah.
medieval view.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so
No, but that's cool. I definitely want to take a look at that.
okay. And the other thing that I was thinking of is that there are kind of interesting philosophical implications that one can pull out of different translations of different bits of catechism. And one of the things that kept popping into my head is that in the Czech Ave Maria, the blessing is, blessed is the fruit of your life rather than the fruit of your womb.
Nice.
And I kind of thought, like, oh, you know, what's going on there? Anyway, so that's why it's not so much a question, or in fact really a comment. It's just a kind of like, here are some things that might be interesting to you.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. And I will check out the Marian Metaphysics book, just because I think that's super interesting. Also, the whole idea apropos pregnancy of being like pregnant with God. There's very interesting articles actually on Marian consent. Because like the angel came down and said, guess what? You know, you get to be pregnant and bear Jesus, God. And she's like, okay, blessed am I, like, how great is that? And so there are questions about like, Mary, did you consent? And
Well, I mean, the whole thing about the Immaculate Conception already kind of, if she's predestined because she's the Immaculate Conception, then
Right.
to what extent can she
yeah.
say anything?
And interestingly, these are like now like fun facts about like early Christendom. The proto-evangelium of James, which is one of the Gnostic Gospels, or one of the like non-canonical Gospels, has Anna, the mother of Mary, dealing with infertility and having this whole big, long, poetic kind of discourse about like, the earth produces fruit, but I do not. And, you know, just really interesting things that I think could be resources for women struggling with infertility. I mean, it's heavily teleological and in ways that I don't like, but I think it could be a good pastoral resource. So there is like really interesting stuff there, apropos, you know, Immaculate Conception and stuff like that. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. So I wonder what on this trajectory from unity to distinction, and
So I don't know how common an experience it is, and I'm kind of giving it secondhand. But I think my partner's trajectory. My son's just left to go to university. I think her trajectory was much more of distinction, very much distinction during pregnancy,
Mhm.
much more of a kind of, well, and maybe less distinction as time goes on.
Interesting.
But I don't know
Yeah.
if that's kind of a kind of pathological case or,
No.
or
You know, in terms of like the story of a life, you know, sperm to worm, birth to earth or whatever. But like the that's a West Side Story reference for those who didn't get it. But like one thing, so one thing to say is that many people experience pregnancy as very alienating, and experience distinction kind of throughout pregnancy in a way that is very distressing. There's a really good book, I cannot remember the name of the author or the title, but it's a trans man going through pregnancy and talking both about the gender dysphoria they experience during pregnancy, and also the way in which, even though they really wanted to be a parent and to give birth biologically, the way in which it felt like their body was being taken over by something in this very alien kind of sense. On the other side of the spectrum, and this is something I have thought about, is the possibility of extending pregnancy, our conceptions of pregnancy, to the fourth trimester, the so-called fourth trimester, which is post live birth, but when the baby is still kind of wholly dependent on the parent for feeding and care and so on. It can't really do much on its own. And whether or not that's a useful notion of like really including the fourth trimester in pregnancy, whether that would allow other persons to be parts of the pregnancy, parts of the corporation, as it were, like the father, for example, or the other parent, if that person is present. So I think there's a lot that can be done in both directions, for sure.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. So thanks so much to Amber. After this, we're going to have a 30-minute coffee break.